Hello. So I had originally 20 pages written, and I was able to cut it all the way down to 10. So I am going to have to speak a little bit fast to make sure I get through everything. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump right into it. So Martin Heidegger's notion of being in the world rejects a distinction between an interior psychical space and an exterior space of action. I argue that there are phenomena specific to the experience of attention deficit hyperactive disorder, or ADHD, which is an executive dysfunction disorder, that directly contradict essential aspects of being in the world. I will contest two key aspects of Heidegger's thought in Being and Time. First, I'll show how the experience of executive dysfunction and what I call motivational inactivity displays a purely internal thought or intention, a thought without action, which leads us to reject Heidegger's anti-Husserlian position that we do not first start from some inside from which we transcend into an outside. Second, I will argue that the experience of temporal disorientation in ADHD demonstrates a form of immediate presence that exists apart from time, a presence without time, and cannot be incorporated into the Heideggerian notion of temporality that grounds being in the world. Is that, oh. Okay. There we go. My first section will describe the experience of motivational inactivity and mobilize it as a critique of Heidegger's initial ontic articulation of being in the world, which will develop my notion of a thought without action. My second section will turn to ontological being in the world and its relations with time and temporality. There we go. To argue that the experience of temporal disorientation in ADHD's working memory collapse represents a breakdown of the temporal situatedness of the present moment to reveal a subtemporal immediate realm of instantaneity. Thus, working memory collapse reveals a kind of presence that cannot be transcendentally grounded in temporality, like Heidegger attempts to do to being in Division 2 of Being and Time. Okay, Heidegger's initial formulation of being in the world in Division 1 of Being and Time unites a notion of the interior and exterior by defining the interior of Dasein as always already on the outside. Quote, when Dasein directs itself towards something and grasps it, it does not somehow first get out of an inner sphere in which it has been proximally encapsulated, but its primary kind of being is such that it is always outside alongside entities which it encounters and which belong to a world already discovered. Nor is any inner sphere abandoned when Dasein dwells alongside the entity to be known and determines its character. But even in this being outside alongside the object, Dasein is still inside, if we understand this in the correct sense. That is to say, it is itself inside as being in the world which knows. By uniting the inner and outer spaces into one notion, Heidegger breaks with Husserl's view of intentionality as something originating in an inside which transcends to an outside. Instead, intentionality is always already a kind of transcendence. Quote, I cannot and must not ask how the inner intentional experience arrives at an outside. I cannot and must not put the question in that way because intentional comportment itself as such orients itself towards the extant. I do not first need to ask how the immanent intentional experience acquires transcendent validity. Rather, what has to be seen is that it is precisely intentionality and nothing else which transcendence consists. He insists that this is not merely some primordial condition we start from and from which we can develop an interior and an exterior. Rather, we are always already being in the world. In making this shift, Heidegger looks not to the ways in which we actually relate to the world, but instead attempts to posit a basic togetherness with the world which makes possible any actual worldly relation. Being in the world is thus the condition for the possibility of any actual relation to the world, which he designates as an a priori existential. A priori because it is always already a unity that grounds our being, and existential insofar as it expresses a theoretical understanding of our fundamental ontological nature. Now to motivational activity, I'll first give a name to a specific experience that those with ADHD often have, what I will call motivational inactivity. This term has three components to its definition. It describes the phenomenon in which one has a basic desire and need of fulfillment. Two, they are internally unable to stop whatever they're doing at that moment to fulfill that desire. And three, they are self-aware of this desire and their inability to act on it in the moment it is occurring. For example, I experience motivational inactivity, thank you, after my meds have worn off at the end of the day, and I'll often sit down at my computer and find I'm unable to pull myself away to attend to my hunger or need to use the restroom. There's the feeling like I cannot pull myself away from the screen in front of me. I find that while I am perfectly able to move between various websites looking for stimulus, I'm unable to act on my hunger by getting up to make dinner. There are three more aspects of this phenomenon worthy of note. Firstly, it is a lack of control over one's body and thus a kind of disconnection or alienation from the body. Secondly, the body is not rendered passive in this disconnect. Instead, in motivational activity, the body is capable of very complex sets of unwilled action, even occasionally involving a great deal of movement. Finally, to speak to the inclusion of motivation in the name, there is an experience that I am in a struggle with my body to motivate it to do what I want it to do. It is precisely because I lack the motivational force to impress my desires upon my body that I am rendered inactive. The phenomena of motivational activity is a disconnect between my actions and my conscious desires, between external and internal. I do not experience my body and its actions as mine, but as a mechanistic process alien to me that I am confined inside. This disconnect renders the activity of the body as non-agentic. Strictly speaking, I do not act when suffering from motivational activity. Actions simply happen. Thus, the experience of motivational activity changes the relationship one has to their body. Where neurotypical people can dictate commands that their body will follow, ADHDers are forced to negotiate, influence, or manipulate the body explicitly in order to convince it into the desired action. In motivational inactivity, external stimuli take over our body from us and marginalize our attempts to exert our desires and intentions upon it. Thus, the world overcomes one's control over their body and comes to occupy it. This opposition of mental desire and bodily action within experience presents a challenge to being in the world in two ways. Firstly, there is an experience of an order of operations to willful action that starts in an inner space and not in an outer space. The breakdown in the translation of a desire into an action thus provides one with an experience of pure interiority, a thought without an action to correspond to it. Second, the way we can experience the interior starting place of our actions is by the fact that there is a strict distinction in experience between inner and outer, i.e. that they are not one. Instead, they can at best be closely entangled with each other, but never identical or united. This distinction is both why we can have the experience of the world invading the body, and is also what protects the interior from the exterior by establishing a firm limit to the world's reach. Thus, the experience of motivational inactivity demonstrates a clear distinction between an inner and outer space that Heidegger is explicitly trying to dissolve. In the experiences of neurotypical consciousness, the transcendence or overcoming of the inner-outer distinction that translates intention into action is a seamless transition. However, in the ADHDer's consciousness, this transcendence from inside to outside is dysfunctional and regularly breaks down. That this breakdown occurs for neurodivergent people with executive dysfunction demonstrates that an inner world of intentionality must only be situated as alongside or oriented towards the milieu of the outer world, but cannot be subsumed by it as being always already in the world. Fundamental unity arises in two key places in being and time. First, with being in the world, which is the fundamental unity of the supposed inner and outer, and second, with the transcendental grounding of Dasein's care structure and temporality. I've already exposited an experience that challenges the former, but for the discontinuity of motivational activity to be a true discontinuity rather than an apparent one, my task must now be to show that there is a discontinuity that problematizes the transcendental ground of Heidegger's project. Thus, I will turn my attention to the phenomena of temporal disorientation. Division 1 of being and time concludes with an elucidation of the care structure, the essential structure of Dasein that gives it unity. In Division 2, Heidegger investigates the mode of care that grounds our worldly involvement as anticipatory resoluteness in order to reveal temporality as its transcendental ground. There we go. So if you look to the diagram on the screen, you'll be able to see the core structure I'll be critiquing. This is a representation of the transcendental grounding of Dasein's being and temporality. To help us with what will follow after the diagram, I'm going to use some terms that are ambiguously Heideggerian so we can get our bearings. The first two levels from the top can be understood as the empirical levels, while the bottom is the transcendental level. Additionally, the top level we can say is the domain of the actual, the middle of the possible, and the bottom of the conditions for the possible. Given that Division 2 is on Dasein as a whole, we start off on the second level with anticipatory resoluteness, which Heidegger understands as, quote, letting itself come towards itself, unquote. It is helpful to bifurcate this phrase into letting itself and come towards itself. He takes off with the second one, come towards itself, as a future-oriented gesture in the sense of moving beyond this former itself. Thus, there must be an originary future that makes anticipatory resoluteness possible. In moving beyond the first itself, we are in some sense leaving it in the past, which thus presupposes an originary past that makes this implied possible past possible. Finally, what anticipatory resoluteness does as a comportment toward the world is it discloses what is there in the world, i.e. it makes present what is alongside us in the world. For this making present to be possible, there must be some originary present that makes the present of disclosure possible. With the Heideggerian structure of temporality established, I wish to turn to a common impairment present among ADHDers, time blindness. Time blindness refers to a poor orientation within the passage of time caused by an impairment in one's executive functions that make up our working memory, which is responsible for providing us with a sense of being oriented within time. The greater fluidity in our experience of the passage of time is itself obviously interesting for a Heideggerian. However, I'm interested in exploring a very narrow aspect of it that I call temporal disorientation. There we go. There's a unique difficulty in trying to provide an account of temporal disorientation, because to provide an account would require that one is able to orient oneself in the moment of disorientation, such that one can intelligibly describe this state. One can only truly talk around temporal disorientation, both in one's description of the experience and in one's thoughts on the underlying ontology. The most noticeable consequence of temporal disorientation is a sudden forgetting of what one was doing. And this forgetfulness thrusts one into a totally alien context in which everything surrounding them suddenly presents itself as new. This newness must be understood as a kind of barrenness, which describes an unrecognizable experience that is not always already laden with concepts. Experiencing something as absolutely new is to experience it as unintelligible, because to be able to encounter something as understandable involves being able to recognize it, and recognition requires a relationship to the past to serve as the basis on which I am able to identify something as a thing I have previously encountered. Thus, being able to relate to one's past is the condition that enables the possibility for intelligibility. However, in temporal disorientation, this relation to the past is destabilized and collapses. Thus, one who is temporally disoriented encounters everything as indefinite, and this indefiniteness characterizes this experience as new. This indefinite newness is present only for an instant, because the mechanisms that orient and stabilize the self quickly recover by reattaching this pure present to the past and thus future. Once this connection is reestablished and continuity restored, one recovers by extrapolating from the newly intelligible context they find themselves in to reconstruct what they were doing, saying, or thinking. However, the contextual extrapolation that reorients them depends on our environment containing clues as to what they were doing or thinking. It is, in some sense, an imaginative reconstruction of the chain of events that led to the action or thought in the first place. But because this is an extrapolation from the present to the past, it necessarily establishes a continuous relationship between the two, and is thus unable to properly reconstruct anything discontinuous within the present moment. It's a flawed and incomplete mechanism that covers over the inciting discontinuous moment of temporal disorientation. Thus, total temporal disorientation, in which the structure of time completely falls apart, is problematic for Heidegger's insistence on the ontological fundamentality of temporality. This is because absolute temporal disorientation reveals a kind of present which resists temporal orientation as such, a pure present that destabilizes the structure of time and which cannot be incorporated back into a temporal organization. It is a moment of time that stands outside of time, not in the sense that it goes above and beyond time as a form of transcendence, but in the sense that it sinks beneath and subsists time. Temporal disorientation reveals a subtemporal moment that erupts into and breaks apart temporal organization. The breakdown of this temporal structure allows us to understand that temporality is not the transcendental ground of our conscious experience. It is instead an empirical condition that arises along with consciousness and experience, not a transcendental condition that enables the possibility of it in the first place. This difference in the degrees to which ADHDers experience the past and future as concrete or abstract is a crucial point of departure from neurotypical phenomenological accounts of time, both on a theoretical and social level. Neurotypical phenomenologists can articulate an abstract account of their concretely experienced time without betraying the phenomenological emphasis on providing an account of the concreteness of experience. They do not have to warp their experiences to fit their theories. However, because ADHDers do not have our own account of abstract abstract experience of time, we are forced to engage with neurotypical theories of concrete time by applying these theories to experiences that do not cleanly fit within them. Thus, to insist on the fundamentality of Heideggerian temporality requires either denying the status of Dasein to those with ADHD or placing the abstract and theoretical above the phenomenal, a move which Heidegger himself criticizes others for doing. Quote, Hartmann's theory fails because for it, this is the very last thing, theory comes first, before fulfilling the requirement to open our eyes and take phenomena as they offer themselves against all firmly rooted theory, and even despite it. That is, the requirement to align theory according to the phenomena rather than the opposite, to do violence to the phenomena by a preconceived theory, unquote. Thus, to stay true to the underlying motivations of phenomenology would require a willingness to reject the claims of fundamentality that Heidegger makes from a perspective ignorant of other possible kinds of experience. Thank you.